Welcome. How you doing? I'm Greg Roskopf, and I'm the owner of Muscle Activation Techniques. And wanted to talk today. Today we're going to go through a little topic. A muscle activation technique perspective of glute and abdominal training. You think about it. I started out my career as a strength and conditioning coach, and you think about it in the sports and performance world, let alone the exercise world. People are trying to strengthen their glutes and abdominals. If you had to say what would be the main areas that people are trying to train and strengthen in the exercise realm, you'd have to say it's probably glutes and abdominals. From a muscle tone standpoint, to strength and performance standpoint, and even from especially core training relative to low back pain and dealing with back issues. I think the core stability is a key concept behind what we're looking for when we're trying to prevent or improve people's issues with low back pain. And so what we're going to do today is kind of take a look at the perspective and see, probably one of the things that jumps out at me is the owner and developer of muscle activation techniques, is one of the most common areas where I find neuromuscular weaknesses is in the glutes and abdominals. And so it's kind of contradictory. It's like, well, this is the area that most people are training, but from a neuromuscular standpoint, this is the area that I'm finding the greatest amount of weakness and vulnerabilities in. And so we have to take a step back and look at what are we actually doing, and is the process that we're going through actually adequate when we're trying to allow us to achieve what we're trying to achieve in our glute and abdominal training. So first, I'm just going to talk about muscle activation technique. Your muscle activation techniques, basically we look at whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. So it's like having loose battery cables. The brain sends the messages just don't get to the muscles, and literally then they can't do their job. They can't contract on demand, so they can't do their job to stabilize joints and protect us from injury. And this happens when you have inflammation. It lowers the threshold. And an example that I always use is if somebody was to sprain an ankle. You think about if you sprain an ankle, it's like, oh, I can't put any weight on it. I can't walk. And so basically the ankle sprain, the ligament's been sprained, but the muscles that support the joint are what got damaged. One of the main concerns, because ligaments don't have the contractile capability to stabilize joints. Muscles do. And so when the muscles get overloaded and inflamed in an ankle sprain, the inflammation negatively affects the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. So the force tolerance levels are lower. So you try and walk on it, and it's like, this hurts. And well, it hurts because the muscles are weak. And when the muscles are weak, it takes less physical stress to create a pain response. So it can't tolerate the forces of body weight, ground reaction force. It basically can't handle the forces being placed on it after the tissue's been injured. Well, that transfers throughout the body. All muscles, when they get overloaded or inflamed, their tolerance levels become lower. And the first sign of muscle dysfunction is you get tight, protective tightening. The second sign is if you keep putting forces on those tissues, they shout out in pain, saying, quit doing this, quit putting forces on this tissue until you fix the problem. So when muscles can't contract efficiently, when you have this altered communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten efficiently. When they can't shorten effectively through reciprocal inhibition, the opposite muscles tighten up. And so it's a protective tightness on the opposite side of the weak muscles. And so many times when we look at muscle tightness, we think, oh, we need to loosen this up. I had a fractured vertebrae when I was young, and the common theme of every practitioner that I sought out was, you're tight. The reason you're having all of these residual issues, I had patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, one injury after another. The reason you're having all these residual issues is because you're tight. And every modality focused on trying to release the tightness, when actually my problem was the weakness. And ironically, as we're going to move into core training, I actually had the trauma to my lower back. My abdominal wall and the core was weak. The inflammation related to the fractured vertebrae made the muscles that support the spine weak, and with those muscles being weak, I had chronic pain. And then my body had to compensate for those weaknesses. And like I said, the next thing I know, I have patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction, just one injury after another. And literally by the time I was 25 years old, I was like, man, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? And so something was wrong. I was a strength and conditioning coach. We were doing core training. We were doing a lot of strength training, but I was in chronic pain. And so there was something wrong with the work that I was doing. And like I said, my abdominals were weak. I didn't know it because I was doing all the abdominal work in the world to try and strengthen my core. But from a neurological standpoint, I basically never reestablished the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And I ended up basically having chronic pain for years. And the problem was, like I said, is everyone was focusing on the tightness, but the tightness wasn't the problem. The weakness was the problem. And when you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And so those muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively. If they can't shorten effectively, then they can't do their job to stabilize joints and protect you from injury. So the opposite muscles tighten up, just like when you walk on ice. If you think about when you walk on ice, your body tightens up as a protective mechanism. The natural neurological response is that when the body senses instability, it tightens up as a protective mechanism. So whether that instability is from an external surface, i.e. walking on ice, or from an intrinsic mechanism, i.e. muscle weakness due to overinflammation, the body goes into a protective state. And so basically, the body loses its ability to move into the extremes of range of motion. The extremes of range of motion are where the muscles can't contract efficiently, which means they can't tolerate forces in those extremes of range of motion. And so we have to teach the body to move. When we have injuries, we have to teach the body to move through its full ranges of motion. And so what happens, like I said, when the body protects and it tightens up, we avoid those positions. We avoid those extremes of range of motion. That's what we're going to talk about with the conventional glute and abdominal training, is do we actually challenge the body through its full ranges of motion, or do we accommodate the dysfunction by training it in the ranges that it's comfortable in? And we'll give you a whole different perspective on muscle function and how to strengthen muscles to make them more functional. Because the whole key is when you have muscle dysfunction, that whole idea, if you don't use it, you lose it. If you don't train muscles through their full ranges of motion and you abbreviate ranges of motion, you're going to lose the efficiency of muscle contraction. And so that's basically what we're going to look at here as we talk about glute and abdominal training. So again, inflammation alters the communication. Muscles can't shorten. The opposite muscles tighten up. The interesting thing is, I'm going into my 25th year with the Denver Broncos this year, and I've been in pro sports for over 30 years, working with the Utah Jazz and then the Denver Nuggets here in Denver. And the interesting thing is how often guys come in training camp and their abdominals and their glutes are shut down. I mean, inhibited due to overuse, overstress. And the overuse and overstress means they're not prepared to tolerate the forces that are being placed on them. And that's when they come in with hamstring strains or groin issues or low back pain. They come in with various complaints relative to pain, but the dysfunction is the weakness in the muscles. When you see some of these guys, some of these big athletes, they lie down on the table and they lie face down and their butt can be huge. I mean, it's like, how can somebody have weak glutes when the size of and the mass that they have? But it's actually how they're trained. And I think that's the biggest key. You can have strength, but that doesn't mean you have stability. So if you strengthen your muscles through mid-ranges of motion, you can have strength, but it doesn't mean you have stability. And the stability shows up through the extremes of range of motion. Muscles have to be able to contract through the extremes of range of motion. And many times these people are tight in their hip flexors because the glutes can't fully shorten because they've been overloaded. So they have these big, strong glutes, but they can't work through their full ranges of motion, and the opposite muscles tighten up. So that you got these tight hip flexors in this anterior pelvic tilt, the lordosis, the lower cross syndrome. It's because the glutes and abdominals are weak and the hip flexors and erectors are tight, just doing everything they can to protect. So how do you make the glutes and abdominals a key component of strength to balance out the body and balance out posture? If you have a lower cross syndrome with the anterior pelvic tilt and lumbar lordosis, it's because the muscles that are pulling you into spinal extension and anterior pelvic tilt are dominating. The hip flexors and erectors pull while the glutes and abdominals can't counter pull. They can't create a counter force to resist that pull. So we have to train our body to understand that. So we know that the body will protect us from moving into the extremes of range of motion when we have weaknesses. And so we need to actually teach the body, kind of reestablish neuromuscular function when you have these weaknesses. Because the first sign of muscle dysfunction, like I said, is tightness. The second sign is pain. And pain typically shows up in the extremes of range of motion. People don't sit here and say, you know, I hurt my back doing this. They say, I hurt my back when I bent down to pick up my child, or I hurt my back when I went to lift the weights and in the extremes of range of motion, or I was swinging a golf club and I tweaked my back. The pain typically shows up in the extremes of range of motion. When I go through range of motion assessment, people, okay, I take them into external rotation and say, oh yeah, that hurts. Well, not only does it hurt, but it's tight. Tightness is the first sign of muscle dysfunction. Pain is the second. You keep putting force on those tissues in the extreme of range of motion, the body's shouting out saying, don't do this until you fix the problem. So the body reverts toward neutral. It reverts toward its center of gravity. You think about when you walk on ice. What do? You tighten up, you shorten your stride length, you shorten your arm swing, and you revert yourselves toward your center of gravity because that's a position of stability. So think about that. The position of stability, we revert when we're dysfunctional from a neuromuscular standpoint, we revert ourselves toward our center of gravity. When we do spinal neutral training, when we try and train the core, the key factors, hold your spine in neutral, lift your legs, lift your arms, do bridging, do all these movements trying to maintain a neutral spine position. We don't function in neutral. The neutral position is the position we revert to when we're dysfunctional. We're stable in the neutral position. We're not stable in the extremes of range of motion. So part of compensation of the body is to say, I don't want to move in the extremes of range of motion, so I'm going to encompass myself and then revert myself back toward my center of gravity. Well, that's the position we revert to when we're dysfunctional because that's the position where we're the most stable. So if we're doing spinal neutral training, and we're not teaching the body to also move. I mean, that's a great position to start from because that's where we're the strongest. But we have to teach the body to move because the minute you get out of neutral, when you bend over to pick up your child or lift the weight, and you get out of that neutral spine position, if those muscles aren't trained to move you through those ranges under load, that's when you're setting yourself up for injury. And so spinal neutral training is a great place to start. But then you have to teach the body to move. Muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. You have to teach the body not only to do their job to hold the bones in proper alignment, but they have to do the proper job to hold the bones in proper alignment through motion. When I bend over to pick up my child, that's an extreme of range of motion, and I need to know that my muscles can tolerate forces in those extremes of range of motion. Because when you have instability, it's instability through motion. We need stability through motion, not stability in a neutral position. And that's what we look at from a muscle activation standpoint, and that's what we look at from an exercise standpoint. You have to make the body comfortable as it gets away from neutral. Because the minute you're not thinking about holding your spine in position and you bend over, the muscles have to contract. They have to contract on demand, and they have to be able to tolerate forces. And so we can't think about it. It just has to happen. And that's what we do with muscle activation techniques is we tighten battery cable. We identify where those altered communication pathways are, and through hands-on stimulation or isometric contractions, we tighten battery cables. We restore the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system so the muscles can contract and contract on demand. So you have to have mobility and stability. You can't just have mobility, because anytime you have mobility without stability, you have vulnerability for injury. But if you provide a sense of stability, i.e. improving the muscles to contract efficiently, tighten battery cables, then the muscles can fully shorten. When the muscles can fully shorten, the tight muscles will relax and allow you to move through your full physiological range, which in turn says now I have mobility because I have stability through that great range. When muscles can contract efficiently, they can fully shorten effectively, and they can tolerate forces through the extremes of range of motion. And that's one of the interesting things is how we train our glutes and abdominals relative to how they function. So with MAT, we basically take an in-depth look at isolated muscle function. I mean, every muscle in the body has its own set of battery cables. So every muscle in the body has a communication pathway between the nervous system and the muscle system. And what we do is we identify where these altered communication pathways are. I always say, I don't care what you can do, I want to know what you can't do. Because what you can't do is breaking you down. So if you can't bend over to rotate and it hurts, or your body's tight and say, oh, I'm tight when I move in this position, or I turn my head to the right and I'm, oh, I can turn it there, but oh, when I turn to the left, I can't, it's tight and it hurts. It's because the muscles that move you there can't contract efficiently, so they can't shorten. Then the opposite muscles tighten up, and if you keep forcing the motion, they shout out in pain saying, fix the problem. You got a problem here. The tightness is the first sign of the problem. The pain is the second sign. Every muscle in its body has its own communication pathways, their own set of battery cables. Like you look at this, the vastus medialis, I mean, you see the VMO in the bottom, in the quad, and it's separated by fascia, and then you have a larger version of the vastus medialis, and you have basically 4 different divisions of the vastus medialis that are all separated by fascia. And they all, each one of those 4 divisions have its own set of communication pathways. And then you see the adductors, the sartorius, the hamstrings running behind. Every one of those muscles that are separated by fascia have their own set of battery cables and communication pathways with the nervous system. So with muscle activation techniques, we basically have the ability to assess the function of every one of those muscles. But now we're going to go into movements. Muscles move bones, and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. Individually, there's no such thing as an isolated exercise. Like you can't say, I'm just going to work the clavicular portion of my pec. You're going to work all the divisions of your pec. You can put an emphasis on the clavicular portion, but you were bench pressing or doing dumbbells on an incline to work the clavicular division. You got muscles throughout your whole body. Your core has to stabilize, your pec muscles, the different divisions of the pec, they all have to work. So you have to think of movements as opposed to isolated muscle function. But the movement, integrated movement, is only as good as the function of its isolated parts. So we'll go through and we'll be able to assess the integrity of every isolated muscle, but we have to determine, what do these muscles do? So that's the first thing you want to ask. When we talk about glute and abdominal training, you have to ask yourself, what do these muscles do? If they were to contract, because muscles move bones, and muscles hold bones in proper alignment, if these muscles were to contract, to fully shorten, what would they do? So if we look at just in the core, in the abdominal wall, it's like movements that we can go through. The structure dictates function, but the function of the muscles dictate whether or not the structure can move the way it's designed to move. So the structure dictates. In the lumbar spine, you have based on the structure, and you have the articular processes that line up against one another. And basically, from a lumbar spine standpoint, we have very limited amounts of motion in the lumbar spine. But as you move up the thoracic and into the cervical spine, as you move into the cervical spine, those articular processes are more horizontal, which allows for significant amounts of range of motion. So the structure dictates how much motion you can have at each joint. The function of the muscles dictate whether or not you can move through those ranges. So if you look at the core and we think, what are the muscles that support the core? You got the abdominal wall, you got the spinal erectors, you got the muscles oblique, the quadratus lumborum. You have all these muscles that support the spine, and I call like a functional girdle, that are all there to create stability around that spine, but they also have to move the spine. And they have to move the spine through its motion. So you think about one main motion, is the muscles in the core are responsible for creating spinal rotation. And another motion, I mean, you got the rectus abdominal muscles that lie more vertical, that they're responsible, their primary function is to flex the spine. And then you got the opposite, you got spinal extension. So you have rotation left and right, you got flexion, and then the opposite motion is extension, and then you have side bend left and right. These are I mean, you can get a combination of all these motions. With side bend in the spine comes rotation, with rotation comes opposite side bend. And so these motions combine with one another, but the main movements that actually occur in the spine are rotation, flexion, extension, and side bend. And there's muscles that are designed to perform each one of those functions. There's muscles in the body that have the primary function that you said, if this is what you're asking me, what do? I side bend the spine. What do? I flex the spine. What do the obliques do? I rotate the spine. So every muscle has a predominant function based on its alignment and based on the alignment between its origin and insertion. And then you have hip flexion, hip extension. So when we talk about the glutes, they got the asterisks because hip flexors are the antagonists to the glutes. So if the glutes and hamstrings are weak, the hip flexors tighten up. So you got agonist, antagonist motion, hip flexion, hip extension. So we got the glutes and hamstrings on that hip extension side of it. So we have to ask, what do these muscles do? And can they perform the function that they're designed to do? And the question is, how do we know? From a muscle activation technique standpoint, like I said, we have the ability to test to say, oh, and if you're a spinal rotator, can you resist a force in spinal rotation? If not, then there's a problem. There's altered communication due to inflammation, which we need to address. But from a key standpoint, these are the main motions we have to consider when we're looking at glute and abdominal training. But that key of what I said is, what do these muscles do? So the rectus abdominis, you got 4 divisions of the rectus abdominis that are all separated by fascia, but they're all integrated. The fascial attachments are basically, I mean, you still have the alignment, a vertical alignment of the rectus abdominis on each side, and those muscles have one main primary function, and that's to flex the spine. If they fully shorten, the spine will fully flex. If they fully lengthen, the spine will fully extend. And so if they can't fully lengthen, it will limit the amount of motion in spinal extension. And if they can't fully shorten, it will limit the amount of motion in spinal flexion. So I bend down to touch my toes. If I have altered communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, and or I haven't trained my abdominals correctly, because I said if you don't use it, you lose it. If you haven't trained the abdominals to move through spinal flexion, the rectus abdominis muscles, you will lose the ability for those muscles to contract efficiently, and the opposite muscles, i.e. the spinal erectors, will tighten up. So sit-ups, I mean, can be a great movement. We've gotten away from the movement type of core training. I mean, sit-ups, I mean, what do? We do crunches. Think about what happens when we do crunches. Are we fully flexing? Are we fully shortening this whole abdominal wall? We're just doing these. That's like doing bicep curls like this. Taking the last 10 degrees or the first 10 degrees of motion and saying, I'm just going to do bicep curls and doing 10 degree ranges of motion. We know we're going to work the muscle to its full range of motion. But when we do core stability or spinal neutral training, we're keeping those muscles in one position and saying, now let's lift the arm, let's lift the legs, let's get those muscles to contract. Again, think about when you walk on ice. What do? You tighten up as a protective mechanism. So if you did EMG recordings and tried to say how much muscle activity is there, there'd be a lot of muscle activity in probably every muscle in the body, because the body's doing anything and everything it can to try and tighten up and protect itself from slipping and falling. So spinal neutral training or stability training, i.e. putting on unstable surfaces, stability training can end up having the effect of saying, I'll get increased EMG activity because anything and everything will contract. So we're going to see, I mean, great spikes in muscle activity, but we haven't taught the muscles how to contract through their full ranges of motion, which means we haven't taught them how to stabilize through their full ranges of motion. Right now, we're just talking about the rectus abdominis muscles. Those are the muscles that have the primary function to flex you so that you can reach down and touch your toes. When I was young and started learning biomechanics and movement, I was told that gravity is what allows you to flex down and touch your toes. No, muscles contracting and muscles being able to shorten is what allows you to be able to touch your toes. And when I developed muscle activation techniques, I told you I was chronically tight. And when I was chronically tight, I mean, my abdominal wall was shut down and I could barely bend down to touch my knees. And the first time I got my abdominals and hip flexors, because the hip flexors are also muscles that can, the psoas can flex the spine. When I got my hip flexors and abdominals activated, I bent down and touched my toes for the first time in 10 years because the muscles could fully contract. And then what I learned is I was doing everything wrong. I went through the rehab phase of it and I did all this spinal neutral training and everything, but I never taught my body how to move. And I never taught my muscles and my abdominal muscles how to contract through their full ranges of motion and tolerate forces. And right now we're just talking about the rectus abdominis. But I told you, we got a functional girdle. You see this shadow of these other muscles that come in. You have your internal and external obliques. Here's a picture of the external lateral fibers and anterior fibers. The anterior fibers of the internal and external obliques create spinal rotation, along with many other muscles, but the primary function of these muscles is to create spinal rotation. So if these muscles can't contract efficiently, oh, I can't turn to the right. Oh, I can't turn to the left. I have professional golfers that come in that have done all this core training. They come in and they can barely turn, I mean, one way or another. And rotation is the key motion to their function, to what they do. And they haven't trained themselves to be able to be strong through those ranges of motion. So they've lost range of motion, which transfers over to loss in club head speed, ball speed. And typically they're coming to me because they have low back pain, because their abdominal muscles are not doing their job to protect them from injury. They're rapidly trying to, hit the ball as hard as they can, as fast as they can, but their muscles aren't trained to tolerate those forces. They've never trained themselves through full range of motion in each of the planes of motion that these spinal muscles or these abdominal muscles are responsible for. So you have spinal flexion, you have spinal rotation, you have spinal extension and side bend. You have all the spinal erectors that are responsible for extension of the spine. You got the quadratus lumborum and many, the iliocostalis, multifidus that have more of alignment. You have these muscles that actually can create side bend in the spine along with the lateral fibers of the internal and external oblique. You have muscles that are designed to perform those functions. Those muscles need to be trained to do what they're designed to do, not to hold you in neutral, but to teach you to move. I need to side bend to the right. I need to side bend to the left. I need to rotate to the right. I need to rotate to the left. I need to flex. I need to extend. The muscles that move you into those positions have to be able to contract through those ranges, and they have to be strengthened through those ranges. So the neutral position is a great place to start, but you have to teach the body how to be strong through their full ranges of motion. Rectus abdominis flexion, you can do sit-ups, reverse crunches, whatever, leg lifts. You can do any of the movements that are designed to fully lengthen and fully shorten the abdominal wall, the rectus abdominis, the anterior abdominal wall. Then you have to have muscles that are able to do the side bend. You can put them on a Roman chair and do side bending type muscles. And rotation, we have both an upper body rotation machine where the fixed axis is the pelvis and you're reproducing force through rotating the spine through the shoulder, or we have another piece of equipment where the shoulders are fixed and you have inversion of action where the pelvis rotates on a fixed thorax. So we're teaching the body, and we teach our clients not only how to get the muscles activated and get them so they can tolerate and move through their full ranges of motion, then we follow up by strengthening them through their full ranges of motion. So many times from an abdominal standpoint, many times most people haven't trained themselves to move through the ranges of motion that the abdominals and spinal erectors and your core muscles are designed to move through. And when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively. When you don't train the muscles to shorten effectively or train them through their full ranges of motion, over time, the opposite muscles tighten up and protect you from moving through the ranges. The first sign of neuromuscular weakness is tightness. The second sign is pain. And you will see anyone that comes in with pain in the low back, and you'll find that one or more of those motions they can't move in. So tightness is the first sign of the neuromuscular dysfunction. Pain is the second. And most of the back issues that I see, I had a pro golfer that came in with a herniated disc, and his abdominal wall was so weak. And it's like the rotation. the erector spinae muscles were, the oblique muscles were so weak that they couldn't tolerate the forces of his golf swing, and he had a herniated disc. As we got the muscles activated and as we got his muscles stronger through great ranges of motion, he went on and he ended up 6 weeks later, ended up winning on the PGA Tour. His motion came back, the pain went away, and he was able to play, and he ended up winning a tournament. And so muscles move bones, and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. So that's the glutes. That's the abdominals. And so when you think about it, we go back to the foundation of core stability. We revert ourselves toward our center of gravity. If we train in the position that we revert to when we're dysfunctional, we're not doing anything to expand our horizon. I need to move. The body needs to move through all the planes that the structure dictates that it can move through, and the muscles have to be taught and trained to be able to do it. Through MAT, we reestablish neuromuscular function, and then we follow it up with exercise. I always say there's no such thing as corrective exercise, because we have to get the muscles activated, i.e. tighten battery cables, then follow it up with reinforcement exercises. But you have to teach the body to move through its full ranges of motion. First without load, then you can progressively add load. And you think of a strength and endurance standpoint, I had a guy coming in that used to come and his abdominals would be shut down. He golfs a lot, and he'd come in and his abdominals would be weak all the time. He'd be limited in range of motion. He'd have back pain. He's like, I do 75 crunches, 3 times a day. And think about that. That's that's repetition. That's endurance. That's not strength. He's doing these 75 crunches 3 times a day, but not only is it not strength, but he's also not moving the muscles and training them through their full ranges of motion. When I test muscles, when we test muscles through muscle activation technique, we don't test the muscles to see if they can contract and withstand force in neutral. We test them to see if they can withstand force in an extreme of range of motion. I'm going to have you fully rotate. Now prove to me that you can hold that shortened position of the rotators. And you know what, when you're doing crunches all day long and now all of a sudden somebody takes you into the extreme and sees if you can withstand forces, the muscles show up as being weak. So the conversation I had to have with him is you have 2 problems here. You're doing 75 crunches, you're doing endurance training, you're not doing strength training. You need strength. These muscles need to be strong. We know in the exercise world, it doesn't matter whether muscles are predominantly slow twitch or fast twitch. There's a certain percentage of fast twitch fibers and a certain percentage of slow twitch, and you got to get the strength in the muscles. You can have all the endurance you want, but you have to have the strength through great ranges of motion. And then again, the range of motion is the key. So we switched him over to an exercise program where we're actually teaching his body to strengthen and under load to be able to do these ranges of motion. His strength levels have decreased or increased dramatically, and he doesn't come down with his abdominal wall shut down anymore. His driving distance has improved, his range of motion has improved, and he's a 60-year-old man that, thought he was on a downward spiral with chronic pain. So muscles move bone. Pain is an indicator something's wrong. The muscles move bones, and if they can't move the bones, then the opposite muscles tighten up, and other muscles, then eventually they shout out in pain. We can improve muscle strength and ability to move through the range of motion. You decrease muscle tightness, you decrease pain. So that's the core. Then we got the glutes. Then you look at the glutes. What do these muscles do? They extend the hip. They're hip extensors. Extending the hip. So the question that I would ask, if you went into the gym, what would you say would be the main muscles main exercises that you use to strengthen the glutes? Conventional exercises for the glutes, squats, step-ups, lunges, bridges. All of these movements are designed to strengthen the glutes. Said you have these big athletes that work with the Broncos, they can squat 500 pounds. They come in, they lie on the table and they got this mass on their posterior side, their glutes, but they test weak because they're in an anterior pelvic tilt. They're basically in a hip flex position. You think of the lumbar lordosis, anterior pelvic tilt postural position. I would say from a postural standpoint, if you start from a bad position, you can never get in a good position. But you see these guys with the anterior pelvic tilt, big glutes, abdominal wall, belly sticking out because everything's rotated. We train ourselves. When we do squats, we come up to vertical. When we stand vertical with the weights on our back, our pelvis is still anteriorly tilt. We're in the lumbar lordosis. We are in no range. Typically, we're in a hip flex position at the extreme end range of our squat position. As we come up back to neutral, and we're in a hip flex position. When we do step ups, we step up on the bench. We load the glute in a hip flex position. Then if anything, we step all the way up the vertical. If anything, we are in a neutral position of the hip. We do lunges. We step out, we load one leg, we load the glute as we load it in a lengthened position, but then we push back, and by the time we get to neutral, we don't even have any force on that leg. The bridges bring us back. The bridges can bring you back so that the glutes are horizontal and parallel to the ground. But every one of these, I said, ask the question, what do these muscles do? They extend the hip. Not one of the exercises that we talked about right here take you into a hip extended position. Literally, the Jane Fonda doggy kicks and the exercises with Jane Fonda, I mean, those are the type of exercises that actually bring the hip into an extended position. And most of the exercises we do under load or strain are not even strengthening the muscles into the shortened position, which is a hip extended position. So we have a 4-way hip machine here in our office and training, and that's one of the most important pieces of exercise equipment that we have, because I can have people train and drive their leg into hip extension, hip flexion being the opposite, full range of motion, hip flexion, full range of motion, hip extension. Unless, I mean, guys are sprinting, even joggers. I mean, people, endurance athletes, joggers, runners, they never get into a fully hip extended position. And that's why you see as people age, men, their pants are hanging flat, straight down, because they've done nothing to develop the glutes, because they don't do anything that basically brings the glutes into its shortened position, which is hip extension. So that's all the exercises that we do. For core is maintain neutral. For glutes are to take us into a abbreviated range of motion, load the glutes in the lengthened position, but by the time we get back to neutral, we don't even have them under load, or we never even take them into a hip extended position. Through muscle activation techniques, we test muscles in the shortened position to determine, can these muscles withstand a force through their extremes of range of motion. If somebody has tight hip flexors, it's typically because their glutes can't fully extend the hip. When muscles can't contract efficiently, the opposite muscles tighten up. We want to assess the ability of their muscles to contract in a shortened range. So I'll bring the leg up into an extended position. That's hip extension. I'm stabilizing the pelvis. I'm bringing up into hip extension. I want you to, I don't even know the answer here. Try and resist me. Oh. So there we have a strong glute. I'd usually switch side, but I'm going to do it from the same side. See how I have them in a hip extended position? Hold up. So we have strong glutes. So the nice thing, when I have people, I said I have athletes, football players come in, and when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively. When they can't shorten effectively, we take them in that short range where there's tissue tension in the antagonist muscles, which are the hip flexors. Then if there's a weakness, they can't contract. And they can't withstand any force. Hold here again. There's different divisions of the glutes. Bring them here. Hold up. Just literally, I think you can see that. Hold up. I'm not even pushing hard. When I bring them in here in the neutral position, this is a sacral division of the glutes. There's 3 different divisions of the glutes that we're able to assess. The coccygeal has internal rotation. Hold up. So he has strength in the coccygeal and the sacral division of the glutes, but when I bring them out into abduction, the iliac division of the glute, hold up. I don't even have to push. There's a weakness. So the body is saying, I cannot withstand a force in that shortened position. But watch what happens. I'm only going to lift him up a little bit. Hold up here. He's strong as can be. I have him abducted. I bring him up maybe 5 degrees. Hold up. Strong as can be. Bring him into full hip extension. Hold. He's weak as can be. So what is that showing? In a neutral position, he's strong. we revert ourselves toward our center of gravity. The body tightens up to protect because it knows it's unstable in the extremes of range of motion. I mean, reciprocal inhibition is a great process designed by the nervous system that says, I'm not going to let you move into the positions of instability. Because when muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively. And if they can't shorten effectively, they can't tolerate forces in an extreme of range of motion. So the opposite muscles tighten up. He has a weakness in the extreme of range of motion on the iliac division of the glute max. And so that's, I always say, I don't care what you can do, I want to know what you can't do. So he may deviate in his gait patterns to avoid being in a position of abduction and external rotation in the hip extended position. So the body has to compensate for those weaknesses. Now, we identify him, we're going to get him activated, and then we'd be doing exercises to strengthen him in hip extension from a slightly abducted position. So there's a process that we have to go through, but the key is in order to have strength and exercise, if he does squats, well, he squats regularly, I know that. And if he does squats, lunges, deadlifts, everything, that's not going to do anything to strengthen the muscles in a hip extended position. You have to focus on the muscles to get them strong through their full range of motion. So go ahead and flip over. And go ahead and sit up. So in the same philosophy from an abdominal standpoint, put your hands over your shoulders. I would evaluate a first thing with muscle activation techniques. Turn all the way, then turn all the way the other way. Feel tighter one way than the other. So he feels tighter on the right side. So then we would go through and say, okay, if he can't rotate to the right, then we need to test every muscle that's a right rotator to determine which muscles can't contract efficiently, because the reason that he can't rotate to the right is not because the left rotators are tight, it's because the right rotators that move him into that position are potentially weak. One or more of the right rotators are potentially weak. And then reach behind your back, and then come all the way forward. If he can't move, I turn him slightly, I bring him into flexion with right rotation, which puts the emphasis on the left rectus, and then I put the emphasis, you feel tighter one way than the other. She's definitely tighter on when he rotates to the left. So ironically, when he comes into flexion, left rotation is limited, but when we look at pure rotation, he's limited in right rotation. But regardless, from an exercise standpoint, first, from an MAT standpoint, we have to get these muscles activated, identify which muscles are weak, then we have to activate the muscles, then follow it up with corrective through strengthening exercise. So the one thing you can do walking away from this process is you don't have the tools to be able to assess. MAT, I said we have the ability to test and treat every muscle in the body, up to 276 muscles on each side of the body that we can test and treat to establish whether there's neuromuscular dysfunction. But if you don't have the ability to do that, you can go through particular movements. He said he was limited in right rotation. So if he's limited in right rotation, that means that at the end range, go ahead and cross your arms, turn all the way. If he's limited in right rotation, that means the muscles that shorten to turn him into right rotation aren't contracting efficiently. So without being able to test every muscle, what we could do is say, you know what, I'm going to put a barrier against you. So I'd be on the opposite side of the table, have him rotate all the way to the right, and then I'm going to put a barrier against him and say, isometrically, with 10% intensity, I want you to rotate into my hand for 6 seconds. Low intensity, because we want these slow twitch motor units to be recruited, because they're the ones that contract and contract on demand. So the intensity has to be low for a long duration. So wherever somebody can't move, you can have them do low-grade isometric contraction. So I just did them 3, but 6 low-grade contractions, 6-second holds. And then go ahead and cross. Turn all the way this way. And to evaluate your range of motion, turn. And then go the other way. Feel any different? Okay. So the idea is that as they get the muscles activated, his range of motion will increase without even having to test the muscle. Flip over. But the nice thing here is I took him into head in the back. So I had him go into hip extension with that abducted position, hold up. He's weak. I was able to test this muscle, or I did test this muscle. You know we have a weakness, but let's just say, you know what, his hip flexors are tight on this side compared to the other side. When he's in an abducted position, I'm going to take him into that position. I want you to lightly push up against me. 6-second hold. So where you see tightness, relax. That wasn't 6 seconds, push-ups. So where you see tightness, you can have, say, it's not the muscles that are tight, because typically we'd be stretching the hip flexors. And it's like, no, it's not the tight muscles that are the problem. Push up, 6 seconds. It's the muscles that are trying to shorten that can't shorten under load. So we have to be able to identify and address that. So from that position, I just did 3 isometric contractions, so we'll see if that's enough. Hold up. I'm pushing hard now. Hold up. So the key is here, the nice part is, he got stronger, the motion increased, but more than anything, hold up, he can tolerate force in the short range. Now he can go exercise. So you don't have the ability to test muscles if you haven't gone through MAT and gone through the systematic process of assessing range of motion, leading to muscle testing. But if you found a limitation in hip extension, you had somebody on the table and it's like, oh, their right leg doesn't move into extension as well as their left leg, you can take them in that fully shortened position where you have tissue tension from the antagonist muscle, have them push up for 6 contractions, 6-second holds. You saw I was just pushing and hold up. I was just pushing and he was giving out, hold it. And now it's like I'm pushing and hold, and he's strong. So it's just tightening battery cables. We just tightened the battery cables for his iliac division of the glute. These are tools you can use that as you work with, you can check. And one of the things I will say is that literally we just launched a book. I wrote a book, Jumpstart into MAT, that goes through all the assessments through upper body, lower body, and trunk and spine that allow you to assess range of motion, identify, and then you can actually perform positional muscle tests. We don't get into specific muscles, and then you can do isometric contractions to address the positional weaknesses. It's a great book, a great introduction tool to MAT. It goes through every aspect of the body, lower body, upper body, and trunk and spine, to be able to assess movement and then determine where there's neuromuscular deficiencies. And from there, that you can do isometric contraction to activate it. A basic level of MAT principles that can be implemented immediately. So if you want more information on the Jumpstart into MAT book, you can go to our website, muscleactivation.com, and you can get access to that book. If for any practitioner working with people from a neuromuscular function standpoint, I think it's a great tool to have to be able to address neuromuscular issues. But today the focus was on the glutes and abdominals, and the key to all of this is muscles move bones. And what do these muscles do? These muscles have to move the bones the way the structure dictates that the bones are supposed to move. If the muscles can't contract efficiently, then they can't do their job and move the bones the way the structure dictates they're designed to move. Our goal with muscle activation techniques is optimize muscle function, which optimizes movement, which decreases pain, and takes away any issue. So thank you so much for being here. It went a little longer than I expected, but thank you very much for being here.